Hi, welcome to Get Used to It. I'm Sheila Kuehl, your hostess, I suppose I would be, with the mostess. Today we have what, of course, we always hope will be a really interesting show, but I have three wonderful guests, so I know it will be. The gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgendered community has been very much in the American consciousness in the past several months, sometimes because we get to talk about ourselves and try to say what we're doing, and sometimes because other people talk about us and say what we shouldn't be doing or that we simply shouldn't be. And now as we approach an election, the discussion is heating up quite a bit, and it looks as though after the death of communism that we have become the major target for the right wing, the major source of inspiration for their fundraising. And we want to talk a little bit about what that might mean, not only in the context of the election, but also what it might mean in the context of the national dialogue about what's important when we're facing elections and what's important when we're talking about morality, character, ethics, morals, etc. My guests today, I'm very pleased to say, are David Mixner, who is a world-renowned author, I think sold internationally now, and certainly a longtime activist and leader in our community. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Sheila.
Sky Johnson, who is the Director of Policy and Public Affairs, not Public Policy and Affairs, right. Good, at the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center. Welcome, Sky.
Thank you.
And Sue Burnside, who, according to the New York Times, is a national political strategist. And I always knew that, and I'm glad the rest of the country does too. Welcome, Sue.
Great to be here.
David, let me start with you. As I said in sort of my brief introduction, we are the community now, as our friend Joe Hicks from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference has said, in the middle of the griddle. The light is focused on us. There's full-page ads about us, our ability to remain gay or truly be gay, and we must, be straight in our hearts. What's going on? Why all this attention?
Well, what's going on is that political demagogues always seek scapegoats to build their careers and to raise their money and to enhance their agenda. It's an old tactic that's been used in America since the days of the Great Awakening, the Ku Klux Klan. The Southern Civil Rights Movement was used as a scapegoat in the 60s, and of course the great menace of communism for almost over 50 years in American politics. And part of what's going on, Sheila, is we've become more visible, and we've become more powerful, and therefore making ourselves a target for these demagogues who would use another person's struggle for freedom and liberty as a way to frighten people, to create fear, to create division, and hopefully turn them away from the real issues of the country, like education and health care and what kind of highways we have and our environment. And they don't want to stand on those issues because they're not doing very well. They're usually, you'll find, demagogues beholden to the special interest. And so their job is to turn people away from those issues, to force them to focus on scapegoats, to raise money off of them, to motivate their voters to get to the polls. And it's sad that this goes on in a political dialogue in a democracy, but it does. And in great part, though, I think this is important to say, we should understand that this comes from our victories. I remember in 1974 when Elaine Noble was the first openly gay or lesbian person elected to office. I mean, who could forget who was around at that time? The joy. I was in the closet of witnessing that victory as a political person. It's something I never thought I would see in my lifetime. And I thought she was it. I thought that was going to be it. And then when Harvey Milk came along, I thought, God, we got two in my lifetime. Isn't that great? Today, we have 6 gays and lesbians who are actually the party nominees for Congress of the United States. It's amazing. We have hundreds of gay and lesbian elected and appointed people holding power and responsibility, conducting themselves with a great deal of dignity and integrity. And that kind of power, that kind of visibility makes us a target because we're new. We're an unknown. People haven't taken the time to examine the gifts and the resources that we bring to this country.
But what is the threat of visibility?
The threat of visibility is people usually think that you're going to get something they're not getting. And since we're the new kids on the block, people are not quite sure there's enough pie to go around. you see. Well, does that mean I have to give up some of my power? Or are they going to get special privileges? Do I have to be comfortable with them? Do I have to accept them? Do I have to like them? You know, I'm not sure I approve of them. And, you know, one of the things that I think we have to keep hammering on is that nowhere in the Constitution of the United States does the word comfortable appear as a criteria to enjoy the Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. You know, they don't have to be comfortable with me. They don't have to like me to be free. But there's that sense that they're being forced into something that they're uncomfortable with, that I might get something that they're not getting. Is the pie big enough? Even liberal friends are concerned that we are going to take their seats. You know? Mm-hmm. So those kind of issues perk to the surface to be exploited by those with less morality and ethics and principles than others.
And it's exactly what they are exploiting. I mean, the notion that there might be this sort of inchoate, maybe a little bit of concern, although anyone thinking about it can't imagine, for instance, why, if I were allowed to marry the person that I love, who happened to be a woman, why that would really threaten their heterosexual marriage. I mean, that notion of it, that not being an infinite pie, never made sense. But they do kind of, the right wing has grasped this issue and hammered it home in a lot of ways, that we want special privileges at work, or we want special privileges in terms of recognition of our families. And it has worked for them. But how does that translate into political capital for them?
Well, I think what they're hoping is to turn out their vote. I think that they count on low turnouts. They actually count on democracy not working. You know, they use the democracy as a tool and hope for a low turnout and hope that their voters will be motivated to turn out through whatever institutions they mobilize through, whether it's religious institutions or whether it's community institutions. And then they hope to seize power by making people fearful enough to turn out to vote and to elect their candidates, to elect the demagogues to power. And they're counting on us staying home. They're counting on our family and friends to stay home. And the assumption they're making, which is wrong, I believe, is that we don't care enough about our freedom, or our families don't care enough about us, or our neighbors don't care about enough, that they'll stay home. And that there are people that they can scare enough and feed them enough misinformation. It's the big lie. You know, it's like taking marriage, that somehow us getting married and having full equality, you know, immigration rights, family leave rights, taxation rights, all of those rights that come with marriage, somehow demeans their institution, you know, and instead of focusing on the real problem, which is that they have a divorce rate of 60%, you know, mm-hmm. and that maybe together we can help work as gay and straight to resolve some of those problems that all families have.
So what was the role of these full-page ads about our potential for conversion and, you know, this monologue by supposedly former lesbians or gay men? Where does that fit in this kind of strategy?
I think they were reading their polls, and one of the things their polls were showing is that if people believe that we were born this way, that this was not a choice, they overwhelmingly support us having rights, and they become more comfortable with us and more accepting, because they realize that's who we are and that's what we bring. And so, but if people believe that this is a choice, we start losing ground in the polls. So it was setting the tone in an attempt to draw us, I think, into a debate whether choice or born that way. And the fact of the matter is, I think it was a bad strategy on their part. I thought that we shouldn't respond too much to it, because I think most people have come to accept that we're born this way. And also, the more we come out, and the more of our family and friends who know us, they know that.
Well, I think originally, though, the question arose almost in the legal arena, because like race or gender, which are considered in the law immutable characteristics, if you can just fit into that category, then you could be protected under the Constitution, because you shouldn't be discriminated against for something that you were born with or that you can't change. And it never made sense to me necessarily as a legal strategy, because religion is nothing you're born with. You choose your religion. So if we were to say you have to be born with something in order to be safe from discrimination, so if you're a Jew, too bad you weren't born with it, and if you were, you chose it anyway, it just doesn't make sense. Now, we have a particular place in our hearts in this country for religion. So some have said, oh, you know, well, that's a different matter. But it seems to me that that strategy could be maybe not quite the right choice for us.
Well, I agree totally with that. I mean, we have to remember that Colin Powell, when he opposed gays and lesbians in the military, distinguished between us and the struggle for African Americans to be in the military by saying he didn't have a choice and we did. Mm-hmm. And that was the sum total of his whole argument. But the fact of the matter is, Sheila, is that the argument, I think, has been won. I think people know where we come from and what we come out of, because we're coming out of the closet. And that's what they were responding to, are those polls. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's not even an issue, you see, of whether they believe it or not. And we must never get drawn into those sideshows. And I think those are all sideshows to raise money. You know, they get a topic, they get a Newsweek cover, and then they send a mailing out. Then they bring up another topic, whether it's marriage or gays and lesbians in the military or adoption or any number of issues. We shouldn't get distracted by those sideshows, because there's only one issue. It doesn't make any difference if someone chooses to be gay or is born to be gay or chooses to be a lesbian or born to be lesbian or bi or transgender or transsexual. The fact of the matter is we all have rights under the Constitution. You know, the Constitution doesn't deal with born or choice. It deals with basic human liberty and basic rights. You know, and we shouldn't ever get distracted from that.
What do you think, Sky, on the local level? Are you seeing that this is playing very well in California? Working, I mean, your work is a lot to do with legislation, with initiatives, with the sort of public policy aspect. And you see that David has said we've gained a lot of visibility, we've gained a lot of clout. People think that we maybe have pushed our agenda forward for better or for worse, depending on who they are. Others then are trying this counterpunch to make us sort of the issue. How do you think it's playing?
Well, in terms of the initiative with the ads earlier this summer, we haven't seen any indication that it's playing particularly here in California. But for that matter, we haven't seen any indication that it's playing elsewhere in the country. I think David's right. They spent $500,000 on these ads at least, and there hasn't been any real indication that the American people are buying the basic premises or even care at any fundamental level about the arguments that they're attempting to put forward. There was some polling that was done in the aftermath of the release of these ads, and significant pluralities of folks thought that, and in fact, it wasn't a choice, that gay people didn't have the option of changing their sexuality the way you would change a coat or a jacket. And I think that that shows a level of sophistication, an increasing level of sophistication on the part of the American public. But again, it goes back to the key word that you mentioned several times and that David did, and that is visibility. The other side's arguments have always depended upon the acceptance of myths and stereotypes about who we are and what we do. And the more of us that come out, the more places, whether they're political or not political, activists or not activists, but the more people who tell their parents, tell their co-workers, their brothers and sisters that they're gay, the less likely it is that these stereotypes and these myths will have any traction. And they're losing ground gradually, day by day, year by year. In the overall, we'll lose an occasional battle here and there, but ultimately, over time, this tide, I don't think, can be reversed.
Do you think we're an issue then in the California election?
I don't think we're an issue in this upcoming election this year. I think maybe in the year 2000 there will be more visibility. Pete Knight, as you know, has been circulating petitions to get a so-called California Defense of Marriage Act on the ballot. He submitted those petitions last, well, they're being reviewed right now by the Secretary of State's office to check on the validity of the signatures. It appears as though it'll qualify, so that means that there will likely be an initiative, an anti-gay initiative on the ballot in the year 2000 here in California. So obviously it will be a higher profile. But for 1998, there's no indication that this is an issue that's playing at all anywhere in the state.
But there's always the possibility. I mean, I know every year when we put our legislation in Sacramento, it's January, February the latest, there is always a sort of a couple of people who will bring a bill so that we're secured in our ability to be able to at least try to adopt children on an equal footing with everybody else, and somebody who wants to put in a bill that says we absolutely can't adopt children, for instance. Do you see any way in which one side or the other has gained kind of ascendance?
You mean based upon what we've seen in the last couple of months, or just in general?
Well, since I've been doing this job, which is more than the last couple of months.
Well, I think we're gaining ground all the time. Again, with the qualifier that there are setbacks, and there are homophobes, and there will always, well, we hope there won't always be, but there will be for the foreseeable future. Here in California, and you know from your experience in the legislature, there are certain individual members, like Pete Knight, to name one more time, who has made this a particular obsession of his. He's introduced legislation before, unsuccessful legislation, thankfully, but before he did the initiative, he tried several times to get anti-gay legislation through. So there are those people who exist now. But if you look at Dan Lundgren, who is no friend of our community, has made a very, very concerted effort to style himself as a moderate. He has made some faint effort to sort of extend an olive branch to gay and lesbian folks, to at least suggest that he's not as hateful as we have seen him to be in the past. So he even recognizes that the politics of being explicitly anti-gay in a state like California, and in a lot of other states around the country, does not work. Polls taken again in the aftermath of these ads, national polls, one poll that I saw just yesterday asked the question of Americans across the country: if your congressperson spoke out against gays and lesbians, would that make you more likely to support your congressperson, less likely, or wouldn't it make any difference? 17% said speaking out against gays and lesbians would make them more likely to support their congressperson. 46% said less likely. And the balance, 31%, that it wouldn't make any difference. So that's an overwhelming plurality. And again, that's consistent across the country. An interesting dimension of this conversation is that there is a very, very distinct regional imbalance. In the South, in the Southwest, anti-gay rhetoric does play. If you're in South Carolina or Oklahoma, you might be able to make some hay on this issue at a statewide level. But if you look at almost all the rest of the United States, Americans resist the idea of stigmatizing. They're opposed to discrimination. And that's why the right, the radical right, the social conservative right, is trying to change the subject. They don't talk about discrimination. They don't talk about employment discrimination because they know they've already lost that debate. So they want to talk about sin or conversion, some effort to find something that they can hold on to that can give them a foothold to continue to fight this fight that they know they're losing.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, we certainly have seen an example of ways in which the right wing wants to define morality as related only, exclusively to sex, or sexuality in our case. And if that's the case, it's bad news for our community if it works, because we are seen primarily only to be different because of who we have sex with. I mean, never mind if some of us think it's about love, everyone else thinks it's about your sexual activity. And if morality is only about sexual behavior, then it's easier to characterize us as the immoral minority. And yet, what it does is just like you said, it's and David too, it's like sleight of hand. It's like a magician saying, don't watch what I'm doing with your Social Security, be over here where I'm bashing gays, because that's, you know, where you should be looking. And I think that that's been a strategy that hasn't worked very well. The letters to the editor, you know, in a number of newspapers as I travel, are simply saying, you know, why aren't they talking about the speech at the UN, for instance, or anything that starving children, things that have to do with real morality.
Absolutely. I don't think we've won our battle to win over all Americans, but even for a large percentage of those that we haven't won over, they recognize that this issue is not the issue upon which Western civilization will fall, that there are real critical issues facing all of us in this country. That David alluded to some of them before, you know, education, healthcare. I mean, the litany that we hear in every political campaign. These are the things that voters care about, and they are rightly skeptical of someone who comes in and raising a flag saying, look at these terrible people, they're going to bring the foundations of the society crumbling underneath our feet. Folks are smarter than that, and I don't think that this effort to change the subject is going to work, because what they're changing it to is something that people will also resist. Americans in general, although they like to think of themselves, we like to think of ourselves as a moral people, don't like moralists telling individuals how to lead their lives. And these folks who run around saying, well, the Bible says this and the Bible says that, and using their selective literalism, are not going to be persuasive when Americans stop and take a look at where that would lead. If we use the Bible as a literal example of, or as a literal guide for how laws should be framed in this country, then that raises all kinds of implications for things like divorce and, well, you name it. But we are not Iran or Afghanistan. We are not a theocratic society, and you know, a diversity of religions and religious beliefs, and across the board, Americans will resist in the imposition of anybody's morality on them or their friends or their families or the rest of the country.
Sue, you've been handling a lot of campaigns lately, as we not only read, but we all know about you, and a bright, shining, rising star. You always were a star, but everybody's now seeing it. Did some work on Lois Capps' campaign and a number of others around California, and probably a bunch I don't even know about. We've done a lot of theorizing about how, whether we're truly being focused on, and whether this is working, and you're the sort of the pragmatist here with doing the campaigns. Right. What do you think?
Well, I think it was interesting because the summer articles in the New York Times and the LA Times were coincidentally timed for the Hawaii initiative. It was the beginning of the campaign, and it seemed like they were really focused on aiming their target at Hawaii, not so much a national perspective, but what it did was yield some national media through Nightline and through the newspaper ads. And I think if you look at the disclaimer on that ad, you'll see that the majority of the money was given to those ads by conservative groups. But when you look at the bigger list, you see that a lot of the money came from Hawaii. And so they were trying to frame the debate in Hawaii, is what I really think they were trying to do by spending that money. Because the polls are dead even right now. And so what they're trying to do is find some kind of either moral high ground or some kind of message that actually overturns some of the gains that they've made in Hawaii. So it actually hedges the bet in terms of polling and stuff in order to actually get a lead in the campaign. The interesting part about the Pete Knight initiative is, it looks like it will be, if we're lucky enough to have a March nominating primary, it will actually define who the nominees are for each party. So we will get a more conservative member of the Democratic Party as a nominee. We'll get a more conservative, or what looks like a moderate conservative, in the Republican end of it. And what it's doing is just trying to drive voters, or drive our candidates, into the middle of the road. And so anytime we step out of those middle of the road candidates, we really don't always get what we want. It's always a constant challenge, kind of like you were saying. We present a bill in the Assembly on adoption, they present one against adoption. And when we get moderate-looking candidates or similar-looking candidates, it's really hard to get what we want politically in terms of the things that we think are just basic civil rights.
So you think that this initiative that was, if the signatures are found to be valid and there are enough of them, it would go on our presidential primary ballot if our primaries moved up to March, but either way, it would probably be on that ballot. Do I hear you saying this could cut against Vice President Gore in his ability to...
Definitely.
Because he's been pretty open with our community, certainly friendly.
Very friendly.
And you think this would cut against his nomination?
I think it definitely will be an issue, and what it's going to do is it really defines their nominee on the Republican side of the aisle. It defines who their leader is going to be. So whoever walks out of that primary, whoever wins California, will for the first time in California really know who the candidate is on their team. That the conservative person, no matter how moderate they look, whoever wins is really going to be the candidate who's working against us. In terms of a community. So yeah, I think it hurts Gore. We do have a lesbian running for Congress who won her nomination for the Democratic Party in San Diego, and there's some interesting stuff going on down there. Very open. People feel that they're pretty open-minded as a community in San Diego. For all of us in California, we think it's kind of, one day one way, one day the next way politically. But we're finding there's no difference between someone voting for a lesbian for Congress or someone voting for just a woman for Congress. And so we've done a lot of work down in San Diego to show that she's really viable to our own party. As David said earlier, we're fighting for seats that are traditionally Democratic seats, or we're actually borrowing the seats from our liberal friends, or in your case, our liberal friend. We just took the seat. and so it's very interesting to see the dynamic there. The scary part about the whole debate here is what's going on in Hawaii right now. As you know, there's an initiative on the ballot that was put on the ballot, and it's very similar to the Pete Knight initiative. It says marriage should only be between one man and one woman. And the primary in Hawaii was just Saturday, recently, and what's happening is you're seeing that the volume of hatred has just gone through the roof. Recently, the Christian Coalition and the Hawaii Marriage Freedom Coalition, funny name, huh? Freedom Coalition put an ad.
Freedom for us, but not for you, coalition.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
They put an ad on TV that is just shocking. It's a commercial with a little boy sitting there reading a wedding invitation. And basically, his dad's getting married. But his dad's a white man getting married to an African-American man. So we're seeing all the levels of hatred being piled on top of each other. And it ends with, what kind of example is this going to set for our children? Well, you know, if it's all of us sitting here at this table, it's going to show a good example, because you're treating everyone as an individual. So personally, I think it's a good example that you're showing there. But by piling on racism, by shoving the child into the commercial, you're just bringing up all those other things that the right wing or the Republican Party has used as a stepping stone to get to this point. Because especially in California, we've seen that we're not the first minority to be picked on. Last time it was the Latinos, and thanks to them being picked on, they're the highest voting population for Democrats now than ever before, and they're voting in numbers for our issues. So we're like the last stepping stone in terms of discrimination here. But it was just frightful to see that it wasn't just, you know, two men getting married. It had to be an interracial couple, and they brought the child into it. So we have all these different levels of images that can be drawn from this commercial that are pretty disgusting. I mean, would be the nicest way of putting it.
Well, it's a funny thing. I mean, you talk about the kind of the desperation of it, because there have been so many different sort of tricks employed. The right wing, first of all, had to take over its own party.
Right.
And I think that that was a different strategy in a way for them to see how to capture as many Republican votes as possible to come through early on when they were running for school boards, etc., to come through those primaries to really capture it. Now, some of it was a lot of money. In California, Mr. Amundsen and a number of other people put a lot of money in '94 into the primaries, brought those candidates through. We saw the same thing in '96 a little bit. And that was, I think, a slightly different strategy. Were we also a target? I know that you're not a Republican strategist, but were we, and I guess I certainly could open it up, were we also a target in that takeover? Because that was the first step, really, toward moving the agenda right.
Oh, definitely. It was part of the first wave of the moral agenda. And, you know, it talked about, you know, the agenda was about choice, and it was about having the right family and family lifestyles and what is a proper family. And it was the first agenda. And as you know, in California, we've seen anti-gay rhetoric blow up in their face in some of these assembly races. And I think deep down, people want to be understanding. And I'm going to go back to our good friend Tori, who says, you know, it's about coming home. It's about talking about who we are and that we're not different. And we're just like you and me. We're all the same. We're all one cluster. So I think it's hard when you look at this moral agenda that, you know, we have, it's like almost a polarized extreme we both have. We're saying, here we are. We're here, we're part of your society, we're an integral part of your society, and here they're trying to redefine us.
Did it arise at all in Lois Capps' campaign? I mean, when Walter Capps, Congress member who passed away, his wife ran, her opponent in the final election was a Republican, very conservative man, Tom Bordenaro, who is a colleague of mine in the Assembly.
Right.
And were we mentioned?
We were mentioned in the Republican primary. Tom Bordenaro utilized the what is a very structured information email fax tree system that they use in order to bash Brooks Firestone on being
his Republican opponent.
His
who was
Republican
more moderate.
opponent, exactly, much more moderate, very acceptable. We could probably all live with him on any given day versus Tom Bordenaro. And they basically insinuated he was gay because he voted for gay legislation before, and that was the real core.
Which, interestingly enough, he did not.
Right, exactly.
I wish he had.
Which is very funny.
I would have the gay student bill today if I'd had Brooks Firestone's vote.
Exactly. So they bashed him on what they thought they could nail him on this it's kind of a whisper campaign. In the bigger campaign, though, it was back to basics. Abortion, partial birth abortion, a woman's right to choose, that she's killing babies, their definition of morality again. And clearly, it was an amazing race. I just want to say that that was the most money ever spent on one issue in a congressional special election like that. And we're really lucky to have Lois because there was never a poll that showed her winning during the whole special election. So the issue of the, them trying to define morality didn't work in that race.
One of the things that never changes with these characters is the big lie. They have no regard for the truth. We saw it in the Joseph McCarthy period. We see it on the sexual McCarthyism going on now with Ken Starr. We see it in the in the fight against communism and a woman's right to choose. Hundreds of dead babies being buried under convents. I remember growing up as a Catholic hearing that. The fact of the matter is they have no regard for the truth, and it creates a climate of hate, which we then feel very hurt, and we're drawn into that debate. And one of the things that's very important, I think, as a sophisticated political community, is that we have to get better at not responding to such blatant hatred and charges and the big lie, because you can't answer a lie, because they just make the lie bigger. It's like this big sinkhole that they pull you into. And what you have to do is have people of conscience stand up and call it for what it is, the big lie, and draw the line in the sand and create a counterforce of truth to it.
Well, this has been the issue with coming out. I mean, as Sky indicated, and all of you really, this puts a face that essentially says that is a big lie, because here I am. Although it does create I was thinking when you were talking about that, it creates an additional problem for us, because many members of our community are ashamed of those people who might be stereotypes. They don't want to talk transgendered, for God's sake, much less dykes on bikes or people with piercing. Or I mean, we have a student activist day in the Capitol where students from all over the state who are gay or lesbian or bisexual and some transgendered actually come to lobby. And some of my colleagues go, oh my God, these kids are going to go into somebody's office and talk to them. I mean, look at them. And you think, yeah, look at them. I mean, they're just as beautiful as straight kids who look almost exactly the same with, whatever.
Absolutely.
And, and
the point
but still, this embarrassment, like we have to present this squeaky clean image, is a problem, I think, for us.
Well, it's a problem for those people who feel that way. I mean, we're not all the same. We are an enormously diverse community. It's been a cliche of our movement from the beginning, but it's a cliche because it's true. I mean, we come from everywhere, all shapes, sizes. The important thing is not that we all agree with each other, because we never will, or all be on the same page in terms of any kind of political strategy. But even if the folks who get anxious about those folks, those young people all they need to do is come out themselves. As long as they're out there, if we all come out wherever we can, to whomever we can, and show ourselves as we are, then the big lie will fall. It will fall of its own weight. There's no way in which you can continue to, well, you look at how the stereotypes have changed. When I was a teenager trying to figure out what it meant to be gay, and a word which wasn't even current in that time, the stuff you read, if you could find anything, was that gay men were these sort of dysfunctional folks, unsuccessful, couldn't have a relationship with a woman, pathetic characters. Over the years, obviously that in some ways that stereotype's been turned completely around. Now you hear Gary Bauer going around talking about how we're all high-powered, we've got millions of dollars, we run Hollywood, we go to the gym all the time, and just all that sort of stuff. So it's clear that by coming out, we change, we knock down these barriers, these stereotypes, and I don't believe that we can be turned back. Harvey Milk in the 1970s was saying, and this remains as true today as it was then, that the most important political act any of us can make is to come out. If our organizations are strong or not strong, it's better if they're strong, but even if they're not, if people continue this person to person, one to one, then the other side can't win. And
and we have to be careful not to buy into this conditional freedom argument, that if you only become this, we'll give you your freedom. Or if you separate yourself from these people and practice intolerance towards others, we'll give you your freedom. If you dress a certain way, then you can have the Bill of Rights. Nowhere does that apply to anybody. You know, and all the time when I speak to straight audiences, they say to me, can't you do something about those gay and lesbian pride parades? Do you really have to have them? And I say, do you really have to have Mardi Gras? You know, and can't you do something about those ridiculous outfits people wear at football games? You know, where they paint their bodies and they don't have any clothes on and they make hog noises. You know, I mean, I don't want my children seeing that. You know, I mean, it's that conditional freedom. They don't even look into their own communities, but all they want is you to be this perfect little person that doesn't challenge them to look at the world differently.
But don't you think it's all a matter of control anyway?
Exactly.
I mean, we're not the only community that's told if you look a certain way, better yet, if you could pass for something, you should do that. Right. I mean, this thing about marriage, people say, why are you always flaunting everything? Why are you always talking about this stuff? Why is it always in our face? And I say, you know, no one in my community would even have had the courage to bring an initiative to say we must get married or we must be allowed to get married. No, we didn't bring it up. But as long as we're talking about it, we're not, you know,
right.
Unable to put our side of the argument out on the table. Still, I think that it is really about control. It's this morality thing too. If you can control people's sexuality, if you can use shame, some very powerful emotions, then you can control all kinds of populations. They've done it with women for years. I mean, they get molested as children, they're supposed to be ashamed. They get battered as grown women, they're supposed to be ashamed. And it's very powerful.
It's very powerful.
And it's really, I'm sorry, go ahead. It's really interesting. I mean, they will do anything they can to get converts. They talk about us going after converts. The whole purpose of religions is missionary work, you know, to bring everyone back into under one tent, thinking the same, believing the same, without dissent. And if you dissent, you're a sinner, you're a heretic, you're not normal, you know. And what the most marvelous thing about the wisdom of our founders is that they still remembered their oppression from where they came from, and in England, and the Calvinists and the Puritans and the Pilgrims, and they had the wisdom and the memory of that pain to create the Bill of Rights, you know. And they said, and that Bill of Rights was meant to protect an unpopular minority from the tyranny of a majority, from a majority forcing a minority to think and act exactly as the popular majority wanted them to.
But aren't we still paying the price for the Puritans and the Calvinists?
Oh, yes.
I mean, seriously, can we talk? I mean, we are, to go back to the, I would really like your opinion of this. Don't you think that this country suffers from, it's not just voyeurism or the press focusing on stuff, but this real feeling that when you talk about somebody being immoral, people think right away of their sexual behavior.
Exactly.
Am I wrong?
Right.
No, you're absolutely right. And you know, I mean, to me, I watched the current events and I'm just amazed. To me, what went on in Vietnam was much more immoral than anything we could conceive of today. You know, to have 20 years later, Robert McNamara write a book saying, "Oop, we knew all along we couldn't win and that we were wrong and that what we were telling people was a lie," and to know that they sent tens of thousands of Americans to die in that war and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese to die in that war, knowing that the policy is wrong. Now that's immorality. That's a lack of ethics. That's a lack of principles. And then to make money writing a book about, I'm sorry, is even worse. Those are the real issues of morality and ethics. Remaining silence and genocide in Rwanda. You know, a children who doesn't have a computer or can't read or write or get a decent meal. Those are issues of morality and principle, and not who you sleep with or what you do who you sleep with and when you do it and where you do it. It's quite frankly no one's damn business.
I think that's the position of a lot of Americans, not just in our community, but there are a great many Americans who view morality that way. Things like wars and killing is true immorality. Private sexual relationships, your most intimate domestic relationships, has nothing to do with morality. But there is a significant segment of America that does indeed believe that. In fact, they believe that over and above almost everything else. And I think that the war that's going on, the so-called cultural war that as Pat Buchanan described it, is really between those folks who are trying to impose their vision of morality on literally the rest of the country, and the rest of the country who's resisting that, and some folks, like folks in our community, resisting it very, very fiercely. I think there is a real specific, it goes back to something that Sue was talking about in terms of the political races, there's a real specific partisan fight going on in the Republican Party now, and not so much in the Democratic Party, for control of the agenda between the social conservatives, the folks who want to impose this morality, and the more traditional Republicans who believe that the government should be out of both the economic sector but also the private sector of their lives. And I think the next 2 years are going to be a critical period within that party particularly, and I think that's where another dimension of these ads comes in. I think part of the $500,000 ad campaign was a laying down of the gauntlet by the social conservatives to the rest of the Republicans, the George Bush, the governor of Texas kind of Republicans, telling them that unless you adopt our agenda, we are going to sabotage the chances of the Republicans to win the election in the year 2000. I mean, they've been almost explicit on that. People like Gary Bauer is saying that he will run for president himself to push this agenda, and that he would rather lose in a good cause than support. Well, they've got this phrase now, we won't be doled again. They feel like they supported Dole. Dole didn't do enough for their agenda. So this is where the real critical battle is going to be fought in the next 2 years. I don't think, I disagree a little bit with Sue. I don't know that Vice President Gore or any of the Democratic candidates will necessarily be heard, at least at the primary level, on these kind of questions. But there will be, I think, potentially a tremendous battle in the Republican Party.
Well, I think what Sue was talking about, though, is the hot button issue of gay marriage. With the initiative on the ballot during the presidential primary, everyone is always asked, whatever you're running
Sure.
for, all the way down ballot in our races, what do you think about Prop, X?
Right.
And that's going to be the
Sure.
one.
But that's going to bring out people
on
those folks who feel most strongly about that are going to vote in the Republican primary, because that's almost certain to be contested among folks with a wider agenda. So that won't hurt Gore as much as what the residual will be in the general election.
But they finally figured out that when you attach a partisan candidate to an initiative, that the partisanship of that candidate creates this huge turnout effect. That unless you tie them together or marry them together, then marry them together, then your turnout isn't motivated. People don't go, what they say, down ballot. They stop at the presidential nominee, and they don't go all the way down the ticket to school board, dog catcher, water board, whatever. So the partisanship is tied in there in order to keep people's eye on the prize, which in their opinion is the last thing on the ballot, which is the initiative. But I completely agree with you. Everything that we're talking about comes back to, what am I going to lose? How am I going to keep my power? And the debate is always defined around that fear motive. And I think that's how we differ as people. You know, there's a bright future out there, and their perspective is bringing everyone back. Yeah, but look at how scary this is just even in your own neighborhood. And I think, a part of this thing, this whole media, and, it's just so much nicer to, watch Jerry Springer than Leave It to Beaver. You know what I'm saying? It's just so much more interesting. And we just have this level where we need some sensationalized something in our lives. So when we start talking about morality, we've gone so far off the path from where, everybody was reared, whatever generation it was. It's so far off the beaten path that these things, defining things in moral terms, is what we expect. We don't define things in moral terms like when we were growing up. Are you treating your neighbor like you'd like to be treated? There aren't neighborhoods. There's 10 million people in LA County. There's too many people. I don't talk to my neighbor. How can I define morality? So we're having someone else trying to preach this morality to us.
But do you agree with Sky that there is a greater sophistication? I mean, one of the things that happened in the gubernatorial primary in California is that I think a lot of people were stunned that the candidate that spent those $40 million didn't win. And yet the letters that came to the editor and people who talked to me when I was out, just sort of not on the stump, but just talking to groups in my regular job, would say, oh, I'm so glad that everybody wasn't fooled by all that money. Now that to me was a kind of sophisticated approach. But do you agree that what are we looking at in terms of the voters if this Sky thinks it's not going to work?
Well, voters deserve a lot more, much more credit than they're given. And I think that when you look at these things, what it does is polarize people. So given our current investigation, Ken Starr's situation, what you find in national polls is that people are more polarized. It's not so much that they're going to not go vote. What you find is like hardcore Democrats going, I'm going to go vote for every Democrat down the ticket, right? You find this like energetic kind of thing. And what you're talking about is a very small percentage, like in California this governor's year. you're going to find a very small percentage of people deciding if it's Dan Lundgren or Gray Davis. And, you know, today I'll put it on the line, 150,000 votes going to determine our governor. And it's up to each party to go out there and motivate these people to vote. So these issues for the Republicans are definitely wedge issues, so they can define our issue before we define them. Just like you said, we're not going to go talk about marriage. We're talking about marriage because it was thrown at us. And so we're coming from a defensive point of view, not an assertive point of view.
So does that help us turn out to vote, or do we lose heart and stay home?
See, that's the key. You know, and one of the keys is we have to turn out our vote too. And if we are the first ones to step up and say to a candidate, surrender our rights to make yourself comfortable, then our community is going to stay home. We had the largest drop-off of any group in the country between 92 and 94 because of gays and lesbians in the military. You know, and so we have to turn out our vote too, and we have to be sure that we don't become so afraid of the fear directed towards us that we forget what we're about and what our goals are and what our dreams are and what our agenda is. Yes, we have an agenda, and that is equal opportunity for everybody and equality and liberty. And that we never should be the first to step up to any candidate anywhere and say, oh, by the way, it's okay, come out against all these issues because I'm afraid too. I'm afraid too, and so I'm going to take my fear and withdraw from my struggle from freedom. You know,
David, don't you think to some degree it's like the luxury our community has had? I mean, I'm still pretty young and chipper these days, and I've seen most of the first in California.
Yeah, exactly, Scott.
No, first is the way I'm feeling. I mean, Sheila, Jackie Go, I mean, I can name them. You guys were the first. I mean, these things are so recent and so new, we're almost spoiled. You know, we've, as a, you know, compared to a child, we got too many toys at Toys R Us. And now, damn it, I don't want my truck being taken away from me, and forget it. You know, we're kind of like, darn, what's going on? So I think in our community it's a little bit different at times because I think we've just had these luxuries and it's all so recent and all so fresh. I think that any setback that we're challenged a little bit more.
I don't know if I agree with that, Sue.
Really?
I mean, I don't really find when I look back upon my past that I've been spoiled. I mean, given the AIDS epidemic and given the contracts I've lost and given the jobs that I was afraid and the fear that I lived with or the times I contemplated suicide, I've never really looked at that as being spoiled or having a lot of toys. I've looked through those elections as breakthroughs, but I've also known and lived through the Anita Bryants and the John Briggs and the Gary Bowers and all of those people and the Bob Dornans. And what I watch is our allies become nervous and scared.
Right.
And then we become nervous and scared like we've done something wrong for wanting our rights. And we become like apologetic. Well, gee, I'm really sorry, Mr. or Ms. Candidate, you know, that I've put you in this situation. We haven't put them in this situation. Hate has put them in that situation.
Right.
And what was required is for these people to stand up against hate, to take a stand against hate, to take a stand against the demagogues,
right.
to draw the line and say there is no room in American political discourse.
So don't you think we're seeing that more and more?
Absolutely.
I mean, there's no question in my mind that we have made, by any standard, any historical standard, enormous progress in a relatively short period of time.
Huge.
The kinds of issues that you're just talking about, I mean, I remember in 1975 when I was living in San Francisco. Living in San Francisco, you couldn't get candidates for office to accept donations from the gay clubs.
Right.
Now, and especially in the Democratic Party, they actively solicit support of our communities. The president spoke last year at the National Gay Dinner. The vice president has spoken many times at these kinds of events. And in fact, it is, I don't even think it's much of a controversial issue in the Democratic Party outside of the South.
That's what I was trying to say is that, you know, from my perspective, 1972, I was, you know, playing handball out in the valley.
You don't need to rub that in.
But I'm just saying from my perspective, though, Sky, no, I'm saying from my perspective, yes. I mean, all these firsts have happened. I mean, I'll trade Sheila for the 12 hours I was locked in the closet at boarding school because I was gay. I know that those 12 hours on my psyche are not anything near what Sheila's going to do for our community. Exactly. But I'm saying from my perspective, all these things are so recent, and they're so rich, and they're so motivating, and they just really have motivated our community. And from my perspective, it's not so much, that's what I was trying to illustrate. The point is that so much of this is so recent, and the volume is just so high that they're cutting us off at the past. And I think, you know, hey, we've been through a lot, don't get me wrong. We've all been through way more than many communities, you know, that have been challenged by these things. But I'm just saying that we need to dig in
Exactly.
And that there's a civil rights line to be drawn here.
You know, there's something else too, and that is that everyone in our community who stays home is forgetting that there are probably 98 other out of 100 issues that touch their lives, that they ought to vote for somebody that represents that.
Right.
I mean, depending on how a lot of us have kids. And we're doing a lot about education or not, higher education or not, health care. Is a big issue for our community, and there's going to be broader issues. I voted on 4,000 bills in the past 2 years, just in the last session, 96, 98, and a budget of $78 billion. Wow. And that is not about gay and lesbian stuff, really, mostly. It's about real life stuff that all gay and lesbians participate in, as well as straight people. So I think people have to be motivated to understand that their vote impacts something, because when we come and we use this stage, but other people use this stage yesterday and tomorrow. It just depends on who's sitting in the chairs as to what character this place is going to have. It's exactly the same with the government. Just depends on who's in the chairs, and that will make the big difference. And I hope that our community understands that, because when they try to alienate us, as they have, they're almost saying to us, your family issues will not be heard, your education issues will not be heard, we're not going to protect your students or your kids or your relationships or anything, stay home.
Well, that is the biggest challenge for all of us, is to make sure that folks recognize that real issues are at stake, and to get voters to come out. The social conservatives do vote in disproportionate numbers, and they count on the fact, as David alluded to earlier, that their folks will turn out, and that other folks might be less likely to, through either complacency or the sense that it doesn't make much difference one way or the other. There's no reason in the world why anybody in our community should feel that way, but there are a lot of Americans who have the sense that, well, in the politics they're all the same and that sort of thing, so it doesn't make any difference if I vote or not. And in fact, the other side counts on that dynamic so that their hardcore 15 or 20% can be decisive. They don't have a majority anywhere, but if only 20% of the people show up at the polls and half of them are their people, why out then they're going to win? And they count on that. They're counting on that this time, and and our challenge is to make sure that the message gets out that who these people are, what their agenda is, and if we can do that, then we'll be successful.
How do you see the future going for us?
Well, actually, Sue just happened to open my eyes to the future a little bit, and I realized the difference there is, all joking aside, in generation. There's people Sue's age and younger who have never known a world where gays and lesbians weren't in office. And a lot of people I know who are her age don't know anyone who's died of AIDS. And that's a victory. I mean, that's what we've been working for, is for them to have lived in that world, not knowing the kind of things that many of us older have grown up with. And as you talked to me back then,
great sign of our progress.
It really enlightened me.
It's huge.
Yeah, and when I think of that there is a young gay man or woman who's 28 who's never known anyone with AIDS, who's never known a world where there wasn't gay and a lesbian elected officials, I think, my God, we've come so far away. The future has to be great.
I'm very optimistic. I'm very, very optimistic. I think that there are going to be some pitched battles over the next 2 or 3 years, but it reminds me of the period in the 60s when the black civil rights movement was at the center of the national debate. I mean, there was a lot of fury, and in fact, the opponents of civil rights had the highest profiles probably in that period they ever did. George Wallace, the late George Wallace, John Stennis and others were in their ascendancy during that period of time, but it was because of the fact that finally this issue was at the center of the griddle, as you said before, the middle of the griddle, as you said before, and America was forced to deal with it.
And how many streets are named after Orville Faubus?
Exactly.
As opposed to Dr. King.
Exactly.
Rosa Parks.
Isn't that ironic?
Yeah, it is
Dr.
ironic.
King was
Who
in
would
jail?
have known
exactly.
then? Because we didn't know, in the early 60s.
So I think we can look forward to some, I mean, these days, the 90s, are our 60s for our civil rights movement. The civil rights movements all have their own peculiar characteristics, but they all have some commonalities as well. And I think we are right in the critical moment. But I don't see how we can lose. I'm
going to leave it at that. That is such a beautiful closing, and here we are with something like 45 seconds remaining, so I want to thank you all very much. I never can believe how quickly these hours go by. I hope it was the same for you. I want to ask you, whatever election we might be facing, if this momentary one in '98, or whenever you're watching this show, just do me one favor. Just make sure that 10 people you know actually go to the polls and vote. Better if they're 10 people who might have been ambivalent, maybe didn't care that much. Better if they're on our side, of course. And that way, there'll be so many of us out, there'll be so many of us active, that America is just going to have to get used to it. See you next time.